Welcome back to Lore at Night, where rain gently falls and every story carries a shadow. I'm always curious to hear where in the world you're listening from, so comment that down below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin with the first story. The first shot did not announce itself as the beginning of anything. It sounded like a sharp crack in the distance, easily mistaken for construction noise or a backfiring engine. In a grocery store parking lot in Montgomery County, Maryland, a man stepped away from his car and collapsed onto the pavement. Within moments, he was dead. There were no witnesses who saw a gun. There was no fleeing suspect. There was only confusion and a spreading sense that something about this scene did not make sense. At first, police treated the killing as an isolated incident. Parking lot shootings, while rare, were not unheard of. Detectives searched the area, questioned shoppers, and examined the victim's vehicle for signs of a confrontation. They found none. There was no argument, no robbery, no personal connection that explained why this man had been chosen. The bullet had come from somewhere beyond the immediate scene, fired by someone who never needed to get close. The following day, another man was shot and killed while mowing the lawn outside his home in a nearby community. Again, there were no witnesses who could describe a shooter. Again, there was no apparent motive. The victim had been performing an ordinary task in broad daylight when the shot struck him. The distance between the two scenes raised alarms. The similarities made them impossible to ignore. Investigators began to consider a possibility that few wanted to say out loud. Someone might be shooting strangers at random. As police worked to reassure the public, the attacks continued. A woman was shot while loading groceries into her car. A man was struck while standing outside a gas station. Each time, the pattern held. The shooter remained unseen. The weapon was fired from a distance. The victims shared no connection beyond being in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Fear spread faster than facts. Residents altered their routines, avoiding open spaces and lingering outdoors only when necessary. Parents escorted children from car to school building, scanning rooftops and tree lines along the way. Gas stations emptied as drivers hesitated to step out of their vehicles. The idea that a bullet could arrive without warning from any direction reshaped daily life across the region. Law enforcement agencies from multiple jurisdictions were pulled into a rapidly expanding investigation. Local police departments, state authorities, and federal agencies formed task forces almost overnight. Communication was constant, but clarity was elusive. With no suspect description and no clear weapon recovered, investigators had little to work with beyond ballistics and timing. Early evidence suggested the shooter was using a high-powered rifle. The precision of the shots indicated skill, but that skill did not point cleanly to a background or identity. Some investigators wondered if the shooter was operating from a vehicle, while others believed the shots were fired from concealed positions along roadways or wooded areas. Each theory opened new questions and closed none. Then the pattern widened. Shootings were reported in Virginia and the District of Columbia. The distances between scenes suggested mobility and planning. The shooter was not confined to a single neighborhood or county. He was moving through an entire metropolitan area with ease, striking when and where he chose. The randomness was deliberate. Victims were targeted in places meant to feel safe and routine. A sidewalk, a parking lot, a schoolyard. The attacker did not choose symbolic locations or crowded events. He chose moments of normalcy, where vigilance was lowest and escape was easiest. Police increased patrols and deployed snipers of their own to monitor high-risk areas. Helicopters scanned highways and rooftops. Officers stood guard outside schools and shopping centers. Despite these efforts, the shooter continued to evade detection. In some cases, shots were fired just minutes after patrols had passed through the area. The sense of helplessness weighed heavily on investigators. They were accustomed to crimes that left trails. Witnesses, surveillance footage, relationships that explained motive. This case offered none of that. The shooter was invisible by design. As the days passed, the psychological toll became impossible to ignore. Emergency calls surged as residents reported suspicious vehicles and strangers lingering too long in public spaces. Every white van, every parked car, every person standing alone became a potential threat. False alarms flooded police lines, stretching resources even thinner. Then came the note. At one of the crime scenes, investigators discovered a message left for law enforcement. It was brief, taunting, and unmistakably intentional. The shooter was not only killing, he was watching the response. He was inserting himself into the investigation, forcing detectives to acknowledge that this was no longer just a series of shootings, it was a campaign. The note confirmed what many had already feared. This was not impulsive violence. It was controlled, patient, and escalating. The shooter wanted attention, and he wanted leverage. By reaching out, he demonstrated confidence that he could continue without being caught. Inside task force briefings, the tone shifted. Profilers were brought in to assess the language and intent behind the message. Analysts mapped shooting locations against traffic patterns and escape routes. Ballistics experts compared recovered fragments, searching for any detail that could narrow the field. Every scrap of information was scrutinized, because there was nothing else. The public, meanwhile, waited for reassurance that never fully came. Schools canceled outdoor activities. Sporting events were postponed. Simple acts like walking across a parking lot became exercises in fear. The region was learning how quickly trust in public space could dissolve. What investigators did not yet understand was how carefully the shooter had planned this phase of the attacks. The choices, the distances, and even the confusion were part of a strategy that would continue to frustrate law enforcement. Each day without an arrest emboldened the person responsible, reinforcing the belief that he could control not just his victims, but the entire investigation. As the task force raced to catch up, the shooter remained ahead, preparing his next move. The violence was no longer just about killing. It was about dominance, visibility, and the slow realization that the rules everyone relied on no longer applied. And the worst part was this: the investigation had only just begun, and the deadliest phase still lay ahead. By the time the next shooting occurred, investigators were no longer asking whether the attacks were connected. They were asking how long it would take before the shooter struck again. The pattern had become unmistakable, even if its logic remained elusive. Each incident reinforced the same reality. The person responsible could appear anywhere, fire once, and disappear before anyone understood what had happened. Task force meetings grew longer and more strained. Representatives from local police departments, state agencies, and federal authorities filled conference rooms crowded with maps, timelines, and handwritten notes taped to the walls. Every shooting was plotted with obsessive precision. Distances were measured. Lines of sight were calculated. Analysts tried to determine whether the locations formed a shape or pointed toward a home base. No theory held for long. The shooter seemed to understand the investigation better than the public did. He struck in places that forced police to spread thin. A shooting near a school would pull officers from commercial areas. An attack at a gas station would redirect patrols away from residential neighborhoods. Each response created gaps, and the shooter exploited them. Public fear intensified with each new incident. People began running in zigzag patterns across parking lots, mimicking techniques they had seen in war footage. Gas stations erected temporary barriers, and some employees refused to work outdoor shifts. Schools kept students inside for recess, even on clear autumn days, sealing doors that had once been left open. investigators struggled with the absence of a clear suspect profile. Early assumptions about the shooter's background were challenged by his behavior. He demonstrated patience and accuracy, but also adaptability. He did not cling to one method or location. He watched how police responded and adjusted accordingly. That ability suggested experience, but it did not narrow the field enough to act on. Then, the communication escalated. Another message was left for authorities, this one more explicit than the first. The shooter demanded attention and made references that suggested he was following news coverage closely. The language was deliberate, meant to provoke and intimidate. He was no longer content to remain unseen. He wanted proof that he was being taken seriously. This changed the tone of the investigation. Profilers analyzed every word, searching for clues about education level, emotional state, and motive. Linguistic patterns were compared to known offenders. Some believed the messages indicated a lone individual driven by grievance. Others argued that the tone suggested something more complex, possibly a desire for control rather than recognition alone. The shooter's demands placed law enforcement in a bind. Ignoring him risked provoking further violence. Engaging with him risked giving him exactly what he wanted. Every decision carried consequences, and every delay meant more lives at risk. As pressure mounted, false leads multiplied. Thousands of tips poured in from the public. Many were sincere, driven by fear and a desire to help. Others were fueled by suspicion and rumor. White vans were reported repeatedly, sometimes dozens of times in a single day. Innocent drivers were stopped, questioned, and released, while the shooter continued to move freely. One promising lead drew intense focus. Witnesses near a crime scene reported seeing a vehicle leaving the area shortly after a shooting. The description was vague, but consistent enough to justify a regional alert. Roadblocks were set up. Patrols scanned highways and side streets. The vehicle was never found. Each failure took a toll. Detectives worked around the clock, sleeping in brief shifts and eating meals at their desks. They reviewed surveillance footage frame by frame, often finding nothing more than blurred headlights and passing shadows. Ballistics confirmed the same weapon was being used, but that knowledge offered little comfort. It only confirmed that the same person was still out there. The randomness of the victims continued to haunt investigators. There was no profile that could be used to warn the public beyond the impossible instruction to avoid being outside. Men and women of different ages and backgrounds were targeted without warning. The lack of discernible motive made the shooter harder to predict and more terrifying to imagine. Then, the attacks reached a new level of audacity. A child was shot outside a school, struck in a place meant to symbolize safety and routine. The victim survived, but the message was unmistakable. The shooter was willing to cross lines that most people believed were inviolable. The incident sent shockwaves through the region and intensified scrutiny of the task force's progress. Behind closed doors, frustration boiled over. Some investigators questioned whether critical opportunities had already been missed. Others argued that the shooter's mobility made early capture nearly impossible. The debate underscored a painful truth. Law enforcement was reacting to events rather than anticipating them. The shooter, meanwhile, continued to control the narrative. His messages grew more demanding, suggesting deadlines and consequences. He framed himself as an equal participant in the investigation, forcing authorities to respond to his timing rather than their own. Every public statement was now carefully calibrated. Officials avoided revealing details that could aid the shooter, but they also needed to maintain public trust. Reassurances sounded hollow against the backdrop of ongoing violence. Each press conference ended with the same unspoken question: who would be next? As days turned into weeks, the investigation entered a dangerous phase. The shooter had demonstrated not only patience and precision, but resilience. He was not making the kinds of mistakes that usually accompany prolonged criminal activity. Instead, he appeared to be gaining confidence. What investigators did not yet see was the one detail that could tie everything together. It was there, buried in reports and overlooked moments, waiting to be recognized. Until then, the shooter remained a step ahead, dictating the pace of fear and forcing an entire region to live under the constant threat of an unseen rifle. And as the task force chased leads that led nowhere, the clock continued to run, counting down toward a turning point that no one could yet predict. By now, the investigation had reached a breaking point. The task force was massive, drawing from dozens of agencies, yet the sense of progress remained elusive. Every morning began with the same question: had the shooter struck again overnight? Every evening ended with the same unease. Would tomorrow bring another name, another family altered forever? The volume of information had become overwhelming. Thousands of tips filled databases and filing cabinets, many of them contradictory. Analysts worked to separate coincidence from relevance, knowing that the one detail that mattered could easily be buried among rumors and fear-driven reports. The pressure to find that detail intensified with each passing day. The shooter's communications continued, and with them came a shift in strategy. The messages suggested a desire not just to terrorize, but to negotiate. He referenced money. He hinted at demands that went beyond attention. Investigators now faced the possibility that the shootings were not only acts of violence, but leverage. This realization complicated everything. Negotiators were brought in, and discussions took place about whether and how to respond. Any engagement risked legitimizing the shooter's sense of control, yet refusing to engage could provoke escalation. The balance was delicate, and the margin for error was razor thin. As these internal debates unfolded, the shootings continued to shape public behavior. Outdoor life in the region all but disappeared. Parks sat empty. Children were driven short distances that had once been walked. People learned to pump gas while crouched low, scanning reflections in car windows for movement behind them. Fear had become routine. Investigators revisited earlier assumptions, questioning theories that had hardened into habit. The belief that the shooter operated alone was challenged, then tentatively reaffirmed. The idea that he lived locally was examined, discarded, and examined again. Geographic profiling offered possibilities, but none strong enough to justify a focused search. One of the most damaging obstacles was misinformation. Early descriptions of suspect vehicles and behaviors had spread rapidly through media and word of mouth. Those descriptions shaped public reporting, which in turn shaped police response. Tips increasingly reflected what people thought they were supposed to see, rather than what they actually observed. The investigation began chasing its own shadow. Inside the task force, frustration gave way to exhaustion. Detectives who had spent careers solving murders now faced a case that resisted every standard approach. There was no victim-offender relationship to examine, no crime scene to return to. Each shooting was over in seconds, leaving behind little more than shock and grief. The shooter exploited this dynamic. He struck in areas that had already been searched and cleared. He fired near locations that had been deemed low risk based on prior analysis. Each attack seemed to mock the idea that patterns alone could stop him. Then came a moment that felt, at first, like another failure. A tip arrived describing a suspicious vehicle parked near one of the shooting locations. Officers responded quickly, but the vehicle was gone by the time they arrived. The report was logged, added to the growing pile of near misses, and largely forgotten amid the chaos. What no one realized at the time was that this moment would later matter more than anyone understood. As the investigation dragged on, Leadership faced mounting criticism. Political leaders demanded answers. The public questioned whether law enforcement was equipped to handle a threat this unpredictable. Internally, morale wavered but resolve hardened. Too much was at stake to allow fatigue to win. Another communication from the shooter raised the stakes again. He referenced specific details about previous attacks that had not been made public. The implication was chilling. He was paying close attention, and he was confident that he could continue indefinitely. Profilers revisited the language, noting inconsistencies and shifts in tone. The messages suggested anger but also dependency. The shooter wanted engagement. He wanted acknowledgement. This insight reframed the communications not as expressions of power alone, but as potential vulnerabilities. Quietly, investigators began adjusting their approach. They reviewed overlooked tips and re-examined moments that had been dismissed as unproductive. They looked not for dramatic clues, but for small anomalies. A vehicle that appeared more than once. A name that surfaced in different contexts. A detail that did not fit cleanly anywhere else. The region remained on edge, but beneath the surface, the investigation was changing. The frantic search for immediate answers gave way to something more methodical. Analysts slowed down, retracing steps with fresh eyes, aware that speed had not brought results, but patience might. Unbeknownst to the shooter, the control he believed he held was beginning to weaken. The very confidence that allowed him to operate so openly had left traces. Not obvious ones, and not where anyone had expected to find them, but enough to form the beginnings of a clearer picture. As another day ended without an arrest, the task force understood that they were closer than they had ever been. They just did not know it yet. The case was approaching its turning point, and when it came, it would arrive suddenly, collapsing weeks of fear and uncertainty into a single, decisive moment. The break came quietly, without sirens or press conferences. It arrived the way many breakthroughs do, buried inside information that had already been seen but not yet understood. Investigators returned to the overlooked tip about the suspicious vehicle. At the time, it had seemed no different from hundreds of others. A car parked near a shooting scene, a witness unsure of what they had seen, no license plate recorded, no immediate follow-up. Now revisited alongside newer information, the report took on a different weight. The description did not match the white vans that had dominated public suspicion. It was something smaller, less conspicuous, and easier to overlook. When analysts compared that description to other tips logged days apart and miles away, a pattern began to emerge. The same type of vehicle had been noted more than once, near more than one shooting. This was not certainty, but it was direction. As attention narrowed, investigators shifted strategy. Rather than flooding the region with visible patrols, they focused on quiet surveillance. They watched rest stops, parking areas, and locations along major roadways where a vehicle could remain unnoticed for long periods. The goal was no longer to respond quickly, but to wait patiently. Then, in the early hours of the morning, it happened. At a highway rest area, officers noticed a vehicle that matched the emerging profile. It was parked, among others, unremarkable at first glance. Inside, two people appeared to be sleeping. The timing, the location, and the vehicle were enough to justify closer observation, but not enough to act immediately. Officers waited. What they found inside the car changed everything. A rifle was recovered, along with ammunition and items that directly connected the occupants to the shootings. The evidence was unmistakable. The weapon matched the ballistics from multiple crime scenes. Notes and materials inside the vehicle aligned with the communications that had taunted investigators for weeks. In a matter of moments, the fear that had gripped an entire region collapsed into a single scene under the glow of patrol lights. The suspects were taken into custody without resistance. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final chase. The violence ended not with chaos, but with restraint. For investigators who had spent weeks bracing for the worst, the quietness of the arrest felt almost surreal. As identities were confirmed, the scope of the case finally came into focus. The investigation revealed a partnership shaped by manipulation and control, with one individual exerting dominance over the other. The dynamic explained details that had long confused profilers, the shifting tone of the messages, the evolving demands, the calculated patience, followed by sudden escalation. What had seemed like randomness was, in fact, structured around that relationship. In the hours that followed, law enforcement began notifying families and preparing to speak to the public. The announcement was brief and deliberate. The suspects were in custody. There was no longer a threat. For many, the words felt impossible to process. Fear had been so constant that its absence felt unreal. Across the region, people stepped outside cautiously, as if expecting the danger to return. Gas stations filled again. Schools resumed normal routines. Parents loosened their grip on their children's hands, though not completely. The psychological imprint of the attacks would linger long after the shooter was gone. For investigators, relief was tempered by reflection. The case had exposed vulnerabilities in communication, assumptions shaped by public perception, and the difficulty of hunting an offender who understood how to manipulate fear itself. It had also demonstrated the value of persistence, of returning to details others might discard, and of recognizing that control can become a liability. The man who believed he was directing the investigation had left behind just enough of himself to be found, not through brilliance or bravado, but through the ordinary necessity of being somewhere, of existing in the real world long enough to be seen. The shootings ended not because the region stopped being afraid, but because the investigation finally stopped reacting and started listening to its own forgotten evidence. And in that quiet rest stop, under an unremarkable night sky, the reign of terror that had held an entire metropolitan area hostage came to an abrupt and permanent end. Now, let's begin story number 2. The Colonial Parkway stretches quietly between Jamestown and Yorktown, a narrow ribbon of asphalt framed by trees and water. It was designed to be scenic, not fast. There are no streetlights along long portions of the road, no commercial buildings, and no reason to stop unless you intend to. At night, the darkness closes in early, and the pull-offs along the river feel less like rest areas and more like places where the world briefly ends. On a cold October morning in 1986, a park ranger noticed something unusual near one of those pull-offs. A car sat parked close to the water, positioned neatly, as though its occupants had intended to return. There was nothing dramatic at first glance. No shattered glass, no open doors, no sign of panic. Yet the stillness felt wrong. Inside the vehicle were the bodies of 2 people, a young man and a young woman. They had not died in an accident. They had been killed deliberately, quietly, and with enough care that the scene resisted immediate explanation. The car itself appeared staged, arranged in a way that suggested intention rather than chaos. Local authorities responded quickly, but even in those early hours, confusion set in. The victims were identified as a couple who had gone out together and never come home. There was no obvious motive. Nothing appeared stolen. The location offered isolation, but not secrecy. Anyone could have driven past at any moment. Investigators searched the area meticulously. They documented tire impressions, photographed the shoreline, and examined the car inch by inch. The absence of clear forensic evidence immediately became a problem. There were no witnesses who had seen anything useful. No one had heard screams. No one had reported a struggle. Whatever had happened, it had occurred without drawing attention. The case was disturbing, but at first it stood alone. Couples had been attacked before. Lovers, lane crimes were not unheard of. Detectives treated it as a single homicide investigation, tragic but contained. They could not yet know that this scene would become the first point on a map that would haunt Virginia law enforcement for decades. Less than a year later, another couple vanished. This time, their disappearance unfolded differently. Friends noticed they had missed plans. Family members waited for calls that never came. When their car was eventually found, it was parked along the Colonial Parkway, not far from where the first couple had been discovered. The vehicle was locked. Inside, there was no sign of a struggle. The couple themselves were gone. Search teams scoured the surrounding woods and waterways. Days passed, then weeks. Eventually, their bodies were located miles away, in a remote area far removed from where the car had been left. The distance between the crime scene and the recovery site deepened the mystery. Whoever was responsible had access to transportation, time, and enough confidence to move bodies without being seen. Investigators began to speak quietly about similarities. Both cases involved couples. Both occurred near the same roadway. Both showed signs of planning rather than impulsive violence. Yet the methods were not identical, and that inconsistency made it harder to argue for a single offender. Law enforcement hesitated to connect the cases publicly, wary of inflaming fear without certainty. As months turned into years, the pattern continued. Another couple was found dead. Another car was discovered abandoned along or near the parkway. Each scene presented new variables, but the underlying structure remained eerily consistent. Two people together, a secluded location, no witnesses, no clear forensic trail. The parkway itself became part of the investigation. Detectives walked its length repeatedly, studying sightlines, pull-offs, and escape routes. They noted how easily a vehicle could disappear into the darkness, how little traffic passed at night, and how the surrounding woods could swallow sound. What had once been a scenic drive now felt like a corridor of unanswered questions. Jurisdiction quickly became an issue. Parts of the parkway fell under federal authority, while nearby areas belonged to local and state agencies. Information moved slowly between departments, sometimes filtered through paperwork, and sometimes delayed by uncertainty over who was in charge. Each case generated its own file, its own theories, and its own suspects. Families of the victims pushed for answers, but investigators had little to give them. The absence of physical evidence meant there were no arrests, no charges, and no courtroom where facts could be tested. Instead, there were only timelines, reconstructed movements, and the uncomfortable realization that someone had learned how to kill here without being caught. By the early 1990s, law enforcement could no longer deny what the public had begun to sense. These were not isolated tragedies. They were connected by geography, by victim type, and by a level of control that suggested experience. The Colonial Parkway murders, as they would come to be known, were no longer a question of if they were linked, but how. And, more troubling still, investigators had to confront a reality that changed the tone of every briefing. Whoever was responsible had stopped, or had learned to disappear entirely. The road remained open. Cars continued to travel it every day, but beneath the trees and along the water, the silence carried a weight it had never held before. Because the question was no longer just who committed these crimes. It was whether the truth had already passed them by. In the months after the second couple was found, investigators returned again and again to the same problem. Every scene felt intentional, yet nothing about the evidence pointed clearly in one direction. The cars were left intact. Valuables remained behind. There were no signs of forced entry or defensive wounds that could explain a sudden explosion of violence. Whatever happened along the Colonial Parkway unfolded under control, and control was the one thing detectives could not account for. They began by reconstructing the victims' final hours. Friends and family were interviewed repeatedly, sometimes years apart, as investigators searched for inconsistencies they might have missed the first time. Where had the couples planned to go? Who knew their schedules? Had anyone followed them? The answers led nowhere. These were ordinary nights, made fatal not by risk, but by routine. The geography of the parkway became central to the investigation. The road offered long, uninterrupted stretches where a driver could be pulled over without attracting attention. Some pull-offs were hidden from passing traffic, screened by trees and bends in the road. Detectives considered the possibility that the offender used authority, or at least the appearance of it, to gain compliance. A uniform, a badge, or even a convincing tone could have been enough to make a young couple roll down a window and trust the wrong person. This theory gained traction as investigators compared the scenes. In several cases, the victims' cars were found locked, and there was no sign they had tried to flee. That suggested they had not panicked immediately. They had believed, at least for a moment, that they were dealing with someone legitimate, someone who gave orders and expected them to be followed. Yet there was no definitive proof of impersonation. No witness had seen flashing lights. No one recalled a suspicious vehicle matching a description across multiple cases. The theory remained just that, an explanation shaped by absence rather than evidence. As the investigation stretched on, forensic limitations became increasingly apparent. DNA technology was still in its infancy, and much of what had been collected years earlier could not yet be tested with precision. Items that might have spoken loudly in a modern lab sat silent, preserved, but unhelpful. Detectives were forced to rely on behavioral analysis and circumstantial links, tools that offered insight but no arrests. Another couple was added to the list, and with them came new complications. Their bodies were found in a different configuration, their deaths caused in a different way. The variation unsettled investigators who had been hoping for consistency. If these crimes were the work of one person, then that person was changing methods. If they were the work of more than one offender, then the parkway was something even worse. It was a place where predators knew they could operate unseen. The task force expanded. Federal agents joined state and local detectives. Case files were reorganized, then reorganized again. Timelines were overlaid. Maps were marked and remarked. Still, nothing aligned cleanly enough to move forward. Suspects came and went. Some were tipped in by acquaintances. Others surfaced through unrelated arrests. A few were law enforcement officers themselves, a fact that complicated interviews and strained relationships between agencies. Each suspect raised hope, and each ultimately fell apart under scrutiny. Alibis checked out. Evidence failed to connect. The cases returned to their shelves. For the families, time moved differently. Years passed, but the moment of loss never receded. They watched as attention surged and faded, as new detectives arrived only to leave again. They attended meetings where officials spoke carefully, choosing words that acknowledged effort without promising progress. The absence of answers became its own form of cruelty. Public interest fluctuated. Media coverage spiked when anniversaries approached or when a new development was rumored, then quieted again. The parkway itself remained open and unchanged. People continued to stop at overlooks, unaware of the history beneath their tires. Others knew and avoided the road entirely, taking longer routes to stay away from places that felt contaminated by uncertainty. Investigators revisited the earliest assumptions. They questioned whether the couples had truly been targeted at random. They examined the possibility that the offender had been watching the parkway, learning its rhythms and identifying opportunities. This would have required patience and familiarity, perhaps someone who lived nearby or worked in a role that kept them on the road at night. Still, without a name, without a face, the offender remained abstract. A set of behaviors. A shadow moving between pull-offs and tree lines. By the mid-1990s, momentum slowed. New cases stopped appearing, at least along the Parkway. For some, this brought cautious relief. For others, it raised a darker possibility. If the killings had ended, it was not because they had been solved. It was because whoever was responsible had chosen to stop, or had taken their violence elsewhere. Files were never closed. Leads were never fully exhausted. The investigation entered a kind of suspended animation, waiting for technology or testimony to catch up with what detectives believed they already knew, that these crimes were connected, that they were deliberate, and that someone, somewhere, understood exactly how they had gotten away with it. The Parkway remained a road between historic landmarks, but for those who knew its story, it had become something else entirely. A place defined not by what had been seen, but by what had vanished. And in the silence that followed, one question refused to fade. If the offender had learned how to disappear once, what was to stop him from doing it again? Time did not close the Colonial Parkway murders. It stretched them. As years passed, detectives retired, evidence aged, and memories softened around the edges, but the cases refused to settle into history. They lingered in filing cabinets, and in the minds of those who had worked them, returning whenever a similar crime appeared elsewhere, or when a new forensic technique promised to unlock old secrets. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, advances in DNA analysis offered cautious hope. Evidence collected decades earlier was re-examined, packaged again, and sent to laboratories that could now read details once invisible. Investigators waited months for results, knowing that even a partial profile could change everything. In many instances, the samples were too degraded or too limited to produce definitive answers. The science had moved forward, but time had already taken its toll. Still, the effort renewed attention on the cases. Task force members revisited witness statements, some of them long forgotten. They re-interviewed people who had once seemed peripheral, asking the same questions with fresh ears. Small discrepancies emerged, not enough to solve the crimes, but enough to remind investigators how much had been lost in the early days when the cases were treated as isolated. The question of authority resurfaced repeatedly. Investigators returned to the idea that compliance had played a role, that the victims had been convinced to stay put rather than flee. This theory gained renewed scrutiny as detectives compared it to other crimes across the country, where offenders used impersonation to gain control. The Parkway, with its federal jurisdiction and park police presence, would have made such a ruse plausible, yet proving that theory remained elusive. No physical evidence tied the crimes to a uniform or vehicle. No witness could place a specific individual at more than one scene. What remained were behavioral consistencies that suggested a single guiding hand, but behavior alone could not stand up in court. Families became advocates out of necessity. Some learned investigative terminology. Others tracked developments in forensic science, pushing law enforcement to test and retest evidence as methods improved. They organized, shared information, and refused to let the cases fade quietly. Their persistence kept pressure on agencies to keep the files active. Media attention returned in waves. Documentaries and long-form articles reframed the story for new audiences, emphasizing not just the violence, but the unanswered questions. With each resurgence, tips poured in. Most were well-intentioned, but vague. A strange man remembered from decades earlier. A coworker who had once made an unsettling comment. A vehicle seen near the Parkway that could no longer be described with certainty. Investigators followed what they could, knowing the odds. The passage of time had thinned the pool of viable leads, Some potential witnesses had died. Others could no longer recall details clearly enough to be useful. Even suspects from earlier years were harder to evaluate as records disappeared and alibis became impossible to verify. Despite this, one development shifted the tone of the investigation. A particular individual, previously known to law enforcement for unrelated reasons, began to draw renewed attention. His background, movements, and access to the parkway placed him uncomfortably close to the crimes. He had lived and worked in areas connected to the victims. He had familiarity with law enforcement procedures and patrol patterns. Investigators approached carefully. They reviewed his history, compared timelines, and examined whether he could be placed near multiple crime scenes. The connections were circumstantial, but they were stronger than anything the case had seen in years. For the first time in a long while, there was a name that did not immediately fall apart under scrutiny. Still, the evidence was not enough to move publicly. Detectives knew the cost of premature disclosure. Naming a suspect without charges could destroy lives and compromise the investigation entirely. They continued quietly, building what they could, waiting for something definitive. As the years moved on, the sense of urgency shifted. It was no longer driven by fear of another attack, but by the knowledge that opportunities were slipping away. Every year reduced the chance of testimony. Every lost piece of evidence narrowed the path to truth. The parkway itself aged alongside the case. Trees grew thicker. Pull-offs were resurfaced. The landscape changed in subtle ways that erased the physical memory of the crimes. Only maps and photographs preserved how it had once looked when the offender moved through it. By the time the investigation reached its third decade, the question was no longer whether the crimes could be solved easily, it was whether they could be solved at all. Yet detectives continued, driven by a responsibility that did not expire. They believed that the person responsible had not vanished into myth. He had lived a life like anyone else, aging alongside the case, carrying knowledge that no one else possessed. And somewhere within the evidence, however fragmented, investigators believed the truth still existed. They just had to find a way to hear it speak. The Colonial Parkway murders did not end with an arrest. They ended with a narrowing. By the time investigators entered the modern era of the case, they no longer believed they were searching blindly. Decades of reanalysis had stripped away weaker theories and false connections, leaving behind a smaller, more uncomfortable truth. The person responsible had not been a stranger passing through. He had been someone with proximity, access, and a reason to feel at ease along that road. Law enforcement quietly recentered the investigation around a single figure whose name had surfaced before, but had never been fully confronted. Earlier in the case, he had blended into the background, one suspect among many. With time, technology, and hindsight, his profile began to stand apart. He had lived in the region during the period of the murders. He had personal connections that intersected with the victims' lives. Most critically, he had demonstrated familiarity with law enforcement practices and investigative blind spots. The very traits that once made him seem unremarkable now appeared essential. Investigators reviewed his movements during the years of the killings, cross-referencing employment records, witness recollections, and geographic data. They examined his behavior after the crime stopped, noting the absence of similar violence once his circumstances changed. The pattern did not prove guilt on its own, but it aligned in ways no other suspect had. For the first time, families were told that the focus of the investigation had shifted decisively. They were not given closure, but they were given clarity. Law enforcement acknowledged that they believed the murders were connected, that they believed one person was responsible, and that this individual had likely escaped prosecution not because of innocence, but because of timing. Critical evidence had been collected before DNA science could fully interpret it. Early assumptions had delayed the recognition of a serial pattern. Jurisdictional divides had slowed coordination at moments when speed mattered most. None of these failures were malicious, but together they created a gap wide enough for someone to walk through undetected. The suspect himself would never face trial. By the time the investigation reached its most focused point, he was no longer alive. With his death, the possibility of interrogation, confession, or courtroom resolution vanished. What remained was a case built on convergence rather than conclusion. Law enforcement stopped short of a formal declaration, bound by standards of proof that could no longer be met. Families, however, were left with something closer to truth than they had ever had before. They understood who investigators believed was responsible and why. They understood how the crimes had been committed, even if they could never hear an admission. The parkway remained open, unchanged to the casual eye. Drivers continued to pass through its wooded stretches, unaware that it had once been studied inch by people trying to understand how someone could take lives there without being seen. The road had not changed. The understanding of it had. The Colonial Parkway murders are often described as unsolved, and technically, they are. There was no arrest, no verdict, no sentence handed down in a courtroom. But they are no longer without shape. They are no longer a mystery without direction. Investigators believe they know who did this. They believe he watched couples because they were predictable. They believe he chose locations that offered silence without isolation. They believe he relied on trust, authority, and calm rather than force. And they believe he carried that knowledge with him for the rest of his life, unseen, unchallenged, and unconfessed. For the families, justice came not as a moment, but as a narrowing of darkness. It came in knowing that the truth did not disappear simply because time passed. It waited, and for the parkway itself, the story remains written not in monuments or warnings, but in absence. A reminder that some crimes are not solved by catching a suspect. They are solved by finally understanding who never had to run. Now let's get into the next story tonight. In the early hours of a summer morning, while most of Villisca slept with windows open to the Iowa heat, a house on 2nd Street held its breath. It was a modest white-frame home, ordinary in every visible way, standing just a short walk from the town square. By daylight, it would become one of the most infamous addresses in American criminal history. At the time, no one inside the house was alive to know it. Villisca was a town built on predictability. In 1912, it was home to just over 2,000 people, most of them bound by church, family ties, and routine. Doors were often left unlocked. Children moved freely between neighbors, homes. Crime, especially violent crime, was something people read about happening elsewhere. That belief had shaped the town for decades, and it shaped the Moore household as well. Josiah Moore was a respected businessman who worked for the John Deere Implement Company. He was known for his diligence and his quiet ambition. His wife, Sarah, was equally well regarded. Friends described her as devoted to her children and active in the Presbyterian Church. Together, they were raising 4 children. Herman was 11 years old, Catherine was 10, Boyd was 7, and Paul was 5. Their lives followed the rhythms of school, church services, and family routines that rarely changed. On the evening of Sunday, June 9th, the Moores attended a children's program at the Presbyterian Church. It was a small event, the kind Villisca hosted often, filled with recitations and songs. That night, Catherine and Boyd took part, and afterward the family lingered briefly to speak with friends. Before returning home, they invited 2 guests to join them. Lena and Ina Stillinger, sisters aged 12 and 8, were close friends of Catherine and had received permission to stay the night. The Moore family and the Stillinger girls walked home together through streets softened by dusk. Nothing about the evening stood out as unusual. There were no arguments, no visible tensions, no sense of danger. By all accounts, They arrived home, prepared for bed, and settled in for the night, as they had done countless times before. Sometime after midnight, someone entered the house. What happened next was swift, deliberate, and devastating. One by one, 8 people were killed with an axe that belonged to the Moore household. The weapon was used with enough force to cause catastrophic injuries, yet there was no evidence of a struggle that alerted neighbors. Each victim was attacked while in bed. Afterward, the killer covered their faces with clothing or bedding. In several rooms, mirrors and windows were obscured with fabric, as if someone had taken time to block reflections or light. When the house fell silent again, the town of Villisca continued sleeping, unaware that nearly an entire family had been wiped out within its borders. The discovery came later that morning, after Josiah Moore failed to appear at work. This absence was immediately noticed, as it was out of character. Concern grew when neighbors attempted to make contact and received no response. By mid-morning, a small group gathered outside the Moore home. What they found when they entered would shatter any illusion of safety the town had held. Inside, the scene was almost impossible to comprehend. The parents were found in their bedroom. The children were discovered in an upstairs room. Lena and Ina Stillinger were located in a downstairs guest room where they had been sleeping together. Blood stained the beds, the walls, and the floors. The axe was later found in the house, its blade wiped but unmistakably used. Word spread quickly, and with it came chaos. In a matter of hours, the Moore home became crowded with townspeople, officials, and onlookers. There was no system in place to control access, and the crime scene was compromised almost immediately. People walked through rooms, touched objects, and moved items out of shock, curiosity, or an instinctive desire to understand what had happened. By the time law enforcement attempted to assert control, critical evidence had already been disturbed or destroyed. The brutality of the crime stood in stark contrast to the town itself. Villisca had never experienced anything remotely like this. 8 victims, including 6 children, killed in their sleep, without a clear motive and without an obvious suspect. The absence of forced entry raised troubling questions. The killer appeared to know the house well enough to move through it confidently in the dark. Yet there was no indication that anything had been stolen. As news of the murder spread beyond Villisca, reporters began to arrive. Headlines traveled quickly across Iowa and into neighboring states. The case drew national attention, not only because of its violence, but because of its mystery. How could such a crime occur in a place defined by familiarity and trust? For the townspeople, fear set in almost immediately. Parents watched their children more closely. Doors were locked at night for the first time in memory. Conversations lowered when strangers passed by. Everyone wondered the same thing, though few said it aloud. If the killer had walked into the Moore home so easily, what was to stop him from doing it again? Investigators faced immense pressure from the beginning. They were expected to provide answers quickly, despite the compromised scene and the lack of clear leads. Early theories ranged widely, from personal vendettas to roaming criminals who traveled by rail. Each possibility carried unsettling implications, and none came with proof strong enough to quiet the town's growing unease. As days passed, the initial shock gave way to frustration. The more people examined the crime, the less sense it seemed to make. The careful placement of the axe, the covered mirrors, the decision to spare no one in the house. Every detail suggested intention. Yet no explanation emerged that could fully account for what had happened. The house on 2nd Street was eventually closed, but its presence lingered heavily over Villisca. It stood as a reminder that something unspeakable had occurred, and that the person responsible had vanished into the night. The investigation was only beginning, and already it was clear that this case would not yield its secrets easily. Meanwhile, beyond the town limits, leads began to surface, some credible and others born of fear and rumor. Each would pull investigators in different directions, stretching resources and testing patience. As Villisca waited for answers, the search for the truth moved forward, uneven and uncertain, toward suspects who would leave as many questions as they answered. In the days following the murders, Villisca became a town suspended between grief and fear. Funerals were held under heavy silence, with 8 coffins lined side by side, an image that would remain burned into the memory of everyone who attended. Yet even as the town mourned, pressure mounted on authorities to explain how such violence had entered so quietly and left without a trace. From the beginning, the investigation was compromised. The Moore house had been flooded with visitors before it was properly secured, and investigators quickly realized that footprints, fingerprints, and the positions of objects had been irreversibly altered. Bloodstains were trampled. Doors were opened and closed repeatedly. Items were handled without documentation. What remained was a scene stripped of the clarity investigators depended on, leaving them to reconstruct events from fragments. Despite these obstacles, certain details stood out. The axe used in the murders had been taken from the Moore property, likely from a shed or nearby location. This suggested either familiarity with the household or a willingness to linger on the property long enough to locate a weapon. There was no sign of forced entry, reinforcing the idea that the killer had either been let in or had entered while the family slept without resistance. Investigators also noted the peculiar care taken after the murders. The killer had covered the victims' faces with clothing and linens. In several rooms, mirrors were obscured, and a piece of clothing had been placed over a window. These actions appeared deliberate and time-consuming, which raised unsettling questions. The person responsible had not fled immediately. Instead, they had moved through the house calmly, performing acts that served no practical purpose but hinted at a disturbed or ritualistic mindset. As word of these details spread, speculation followed. Some believed the crime was personal, pointing to Josiah Moore's business dealings as a possible source of conflict. Others feared a transient killer, someone who rode the rail lines and targeted sleeping families. This theory gained traction as reports emerged of similar axe attacks in other states, though no definitive connection could be established at the time. Local authorities were quickly overwhelmed. Villisca's law enforcement resources were limited, and the scale of the crime exceeded anything they had ever faced. Assistance was requested from neighboring jurisdictions, and eventually from state-level investigators. Even with reinforcements, the lack of preserved evidence made progress slow and uncertain. Early suspects emerged almost immediately, driven as much by fear as by facts. Anyone who behaved oddly, held grudges, or lived on the margins of town found themselves under scrutiny. Rumors spread faster than verified information, and reputations were damaged overnight. Yet each lead, once examined closely, seemed to collapse under its own weight. Attention soon turned toward a man who had been in Villisca around the time of the murders. He was a traveling minister known for erratic behavior and an intense demeanor. Witnesses recalled that he had attended church events in the area and had left town shortly after the crime. His movements raised suspicion, especially given the lack of other concrete leads. Investigators tracked him across state lines, gathering statements from people who had encountered him before and after the murders. Some described him as unstable. Others recalled troubling remarks he had made about religious visions and sin. While none of this constituted proof, it was enough to keep him firmly in investigators' sights as the search for answers continued. At the same time, officials explored the possibility that the murders were connected to labor disputes involving Josiah Moore's work. His position with a major agricultural company placed him in contact with dissatisfied customers and competitors. Investigators examined business records and interviewed associates, hoping to uncover a motive rooted in resentment or revenge. These efforts yielded little, but they underscored how desperate the search had become. As weeks passed, the initial shock faded, replaced by frustration and doubt. The lack of arrests eroded public confidence, and criticism of law enforcement grew louder. Newspapers questioned whether crucial mistakes made in the first hours after the discovery had doomed the case from the start. In Villisca, people began to accept a grim possibility. The killer might never be found. Yet the investigation did not stop. Instead, it stretched outward, following faint threads that led far beyond the town's borders. Reports of axe murders in other communities were re-examined. Witness statements were revisited. Investigators attempted to reconstruct timelines using memories that were already fading. Through it all, the house on 2nd Street remained empty, a silent witness to unanswered questions. Its windows stared out at a town forever changed, while inside, the echoes of violence seemed impossible to erase. The longer the case went unsolved, the more the house itself became a symbol of failure, fear, and unresolved terror. By the end of the first year, investigators were divided. Some believed the killer had been an outsider who slipped away unnoticed. Others were convinced the answer lay closer to home, hidden among familiar faces. The truth, whatever it was, remained just out of reach, buried beneath missteps, lost evidence, and a growing sense of inevitability. But as the trail grew colder in Villisca, it was heating up elsewhere. New testimony, years later, would breathe life back into the case and force investigators to confront a suspect whose connection to the murders was far more disturbing than anyone had initially imagined. As time passed, the Villisca murders refused to settle into history. While other crimes slowly lost urgency, this one lingered, resurfacing whenever new information emerged or a familiar name was spoken again. The passage of years did not bring clarity. Instead, it reshaped the investigation, narrowing its focus while deepening its unease. By the middle of the decade, law enforcement had largely exhausted its early leads. Many of the original suspects had been cleared, either by alibis that held up under scrutiny or by the simple absence of evidence. Yet one figure remained difficult to dismiss. His name continued to surface in reports, letters, and whispered conversations. It was a name tied to instability, violence, and an unsettling proximity to the crime. This man had been in Villisca around the time of the murders. He had attended church services, spoken openly with townspeople, and left soon afterward. At the time, his behavior had raised eyebrows, but not enough to justify immediate arrest. As years went by, however, his past began to draw sharper attention. Investigators learned that he had a history marked by erratic conduct and institutionalization. He had been confined to mental hospitals more than once, following episodes of extreme behavior that alarmed those around him. In statements given later, he would admit to violent impulses and a deep sense of inner turmoil. While these admissions alone did not prove guilt, they added weight to suspicions that had never fully disappeared. More troubling still were his own words. In conversations with acquaintances and, later, with authorities, he spoke about the Villisca murders with a familiarity that seemed inappropriate. He described details that had not been widely publicized, details that suggested either first-hand knowledge or an unhealthy obsession. These statements reignited interest in the case and prompted officials to take a closer look. By this point, the investigation had shifted away from physical evidence, which had long since been compromised or lost. Instead, it relied heavily on witness testimony, recollections, and patterns of behavior. This made the process fragile. Memories faded. Stories changed. The line between fact and interpretation became increasingly difficult to draw. Still, the weight of circumstantial evidence continued to build. Investigators retraced the suspect's movements in the days surrounding the murders. They examined transportation routes, lodging records, and personal correspondence. What they found was not a clear trail, but a series of unsettling coincidences that placed him near similar crimes and violent episodes. At the same time, public interest in the case surged once more. Newspapers revisited the story, framing it as a mystery that had haunted Iowa for years. With renewed attention came renewed pressure on authorities to act. The idea that the killer had lived freely for so long was difficult for the public to accept, and demands for accountability grew louder. Legal challenges quickly followed. Prosecutors knew that bringing charges without strong physical evidence was risky. The defense would almost certainly argue that the case was built on hearsay, unreliable memories, and prejudice against a man with a documented history of mental illness. Every decision had to be weighed carefully, as a failed prosecution could permanently close the door on justice. Yet, there was also a moral urgency to the case. 8 lives had been taken in a manner that shocked the nation. Families of the victims, long deprived of answers, deserved resolution. Investigators pushed forward, convinced that the accumulation of testimony and behavior painted a picture that could no longer be ignored. As the case edged closer to a formal reckoning, the suspect's own actions worked against him. His statements became more explicit, more troubling. He spoke of urges, of moments he could not control, and of acts he claimed to regret deeply. While he stopped short of a full confession, the implications were unmistakable. Still, doubt lingered. Some officials questioned whether the desire to close the case had begun to overshadow objectivity. Others worried that the true killer, if different, would never be found once attention focused so narrowly on a single man. These concerns fueled internal debate and external criticism, but they did not slow the momentum that was building. By the time legal proceedings loomed, Villisca was watching once again. The town that had tried to move on found itself pulled back into the gravity of a crime it had never truly escaped. Old wounds reopened, long-held fears resurfaced. The house on 2nd Street, long vacant, seemed to re-enter the public consciousness as a symbol of unfinished business. The investigation, once scattered and uncertain, had become tightly focused. All that remained was a final step. Authorities would have to decide whether the evidence, imperfect as it was, could withstand scrutiny, and whether the man who had haunted the case for years would finally be forced to answer for what had happened in the quiet hours of that June night. The moment of truth was approaching, and with it came the risk of irreversible consequence. The next phase would determine not only the fate of the suspect, but whether the Villisca axe murders would at last find their ending. By the time authorities finally moved forward, more than a decade had passed since the night the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters were killed. The delay had transformed the case. What had once been an urgent manhunt had become a fragile effort to impose order on years of suspicion, rumor, and unresolved fear. Yet investigators believed they had reached the only conclusion left to pursue. The man they focused on was Frank Fernando Jones. Jones was a former state senator and a prominent businessman in southwestern Iowa. He had once been Josiah Moore's employer before Moore left to work for a competing company. That separation had been strained, marked by resentment and financial conflict. Over time, investigators came to believe that Jones harbored a deep and enduring grudge against Moore, one rooted in betrayal and humiliation. What made Jones particularly compelling as a suspect was not just motive, but proximity and behavior. On the night of the murders, Jones had been traveling through the region. Witnesses later placed him within reachable distance of Villisca. In the years that followed, several individuals came forward claiming that Jones had made disturbing statements about the murders. statements that suggested knowledge far beyond what an innocent man should possess. One of the most damaging accounts came from an acquaintance who testified that Jones had confessed involvement in the killings while in an agitated state. According to this testimony, Jones described entering the house and carrying out the murders, framing them as an act driven by rage and retribution. Although the confession was not recorded and came years after the crime, it reignited the investigation with renewed intensity. Authorities arrested Jones and charged him with the murders, finally placing a name and a face at the center of the case. For Villisca, the arrest felt momentous. After years of silence and uncertainty, there was at last the promise of answers. The town watched closely as the case moved toward trial, aware that this moment might be the only chance for resolution. The courtroom became the stage for a reckoning decades in the making. Prosecutors laid out a case built on motive, opportunity, and testimony. They argued that Jones had both the means and the psychological capacity to commit the crime. They emphasized his bitterness toward Josiah Moore and pointed to his alleged confessions as proof that the truth had been buried, not absent. Each witness was presented as another piece of a long-neglected puzzle. The defense, however, focused on the weaknesses that time had carved into the case. They highlighted the absence of physical evidence and reminded the jury that the crime scene had been irreparably contaminated from the start. They questioned the reliability of witnesses who had waited years to speak and suggested that memories had been shaped by rumor and public pressure rather than fact. They also raised doubts about the alleged confessions, arguing that they were second-hand accounts influenced by personal grievances and flawed recollections. Without forensic proof or a contemporaneous admission, the defense maintained that the case rested on inference rather than certainty. As testimony unfolded, the difficulty of prosecuting an old crime became unmistakable. Each argument seemed to collide with the same obstacle. Too much time had passed. Too much had been lost. The certainty the public longed for could not be manufactured in a courtroom bound by rules of evidence. When the jury reached its decision, it delivered a verdict that stunned Villisca once again. Frank Fernando Jones was acquitted. The ruling did not declare him innocent. It declared only that the evidence was insufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. For many, the distinction offered little comfort. The case that had haunted the town for so long remained unresolved in the way that mattered most. Jones was released, and the legal pursuit effectively ended there. No further arrests were made. No new suspects emerged with enough weight to reopen the case. The investigation, after years of momentum and hope, came to a quiet stop. For Villisca, the conclusion was not closure but exhaustion. The town had lived under the shadow of the murders for years, waiting for an answer that never fully arrived. Some believed Jones was responsible and had escaped justice. Others believed the truth was still hidden, lost among early mistakes and forgotten evidence. What remained undeniable was the impact of that night. 8 people were murdered in their sleep, in a home that had once represented safety and routine. The crime shattered assumptions about trust and security, leaving behind a legacy of fear that no verdict could erase. The house on 2nd Street still stands, silent and unchanged. It carries no explanation within its walls, only the weight of unanswered questions. The Villisca axe murders end not with certainty, but with the sobering reality that some crimes resist resolution, surviving not as solved cases, but as permanent wounds.